New York was waiting in the rain, not for a celebration, but for the survivors of the most famous shipwreck in history. By the time the ship arrived, the world already wanted answers. But for the people stepping onto that dock, survival was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Because after the Titanic sank, the real nightmare began when the survivors came home. Just hours earlier, the Atlantic had been filled with screams, freezing water, and silence. More than 700 people had survived, but they had not escaped unchanged. They carried the cold with them. And as the Carpathia crossed toward New York, many of them still had no idea who they had lost. They were alive, but the disaster was still unfolding. On the dock, names began to matter more than faces. Some were waiting for a miracle. Others were waiting to confirm the worst. For many, the agony was not over. It had only changed shape. They had escaped the ocean, but not what it had taken from them. Before they could even speak, the world had already turned them into headlines. Some carried nothing but what they were wearing. Others carried the last thing left behind. New York kept moving, but for those stepping off the Carpathia, time had broken. They were no longer passengers, they were witnesses. And by morning, the disaster had already begun to change its shape again.
Asta, Guggenheim, Ismay.
Among all the names that came back alive, there was one that felt almost impossible to accept. J. Bruce Ismay. He was not just another passenger. He was the chairman of the White Star Line, the company behind Titanic. And that changed everything. Because while families searched the lists for the missing, another question was already spreading through New York with cruel speed. What was he doing in a lifeboat? The city didn't want complexity. It didn't want chaos, confusion, or the impossible mathematics of a dying ship. It wanted moral clarity. In disasters too large to be understood, people do not search for the truth first. They search for a face. And Ismay was the perfect face. Rich enough, visible enough, powerful enough, alive enough. When he arrived in New York, he was no longer just a survivor. He was a man the public was already beginning to judge. Before the hearings, before the testimonies, before the facts could settle, the city was already writing his verdict, in whispers, in headlines, in the way they looked at him. He escaped the Atlantic, but he did not escape the meaning of having escaped. That was the second disaster. Not water, not ice, not steel. Shame. While New York was still staring at the living, another ship was already being sent back for the dead. Not for rescue, not for survivors, for recovery. That ship was the Mackay-Bennett, and its mission became one of the darkest chapters in the aftermath of Titanic. Because while newspapers filled with names, blame, and shock, The North Atlantic was still holding the rest of the disaster. Bodies. The Mackay-Bennett returned to the place where Titanic had vanished, not to search for hope, but to gather what the ocean had not yet taken away. And even that mission collided with a brutal reality. There were too many dead, too few coffins, too little space. So in the middle of the Atlantic, grief became logistics. The crew had to decide who could be brought back and who would be left behind in the same water that had already swallowed the ship. Even after the survivors reached land, the disaster was still waiting in the water. The Titanic did not end when it sank. It continued in New York, where survival turned into blame. It continued in the Atlantic, where another ship was sent back for the dead. And it continued in the stories the world began telling almost immediately. Stories of guilt, loss, judgment, and the impossible work that begins after a tragedy becomes history. For the people who lived through it, surviving Titanic was not the end of the disaster. It was only the beginning.